Hello and welcome! I have been quite busy over the last few months, which is why I haven't made a video. But I decided to watch Castlevania. All I really wanted was some reasonably entertaining adventure to relax to. It was the first show that I'd watched in a while where I was genuinely concerned for the safety of the characters, which is not an easy feat to accomplish given the fact that I have a cold, dark heart. I have decided that today I want to talk about Castlevania. And I want to explore a little bit about what makes it special. If that sounds interesting to you, please feel free to stick around. If not, I hope you have a good day. Before I get started, however, let me first get some disclaimers out of the way. This video contains my opinion. It may differ from yours, which is totally fine. If it does, please let me know what yours is in the comments. I would love to hear. This video will also contain spoilers. Finally, I am not familiar with the source material for Castlevania as I have not played the games. In 2017, Netflix premiered their animated version of Castlevania, based upon the video game series whose first iteration released in 1989. Stupid! Broadly speaking, Castlevania is about vampires. The Netflix series, specifically, tells the story of Vlad Dracula Tepesh. It revolves around Dracula and the events surrounding his crusade against the people of Wallachia, Transylvania. All in all, the series is really quite strong. Its successes on a technical level are considerable, and I have relatively few critiques. Visually speaking, it provides the viewer with a strong showing. The art style can at times be simple. Characters sometimes look a little sparse on detail, and colours are often quite uniformly applied. Reminds me of an episode of one of the old Scooby-Doo shows. Where am I? My screen. On the positive side, the animation is excellent when it needs to be, and they really provide the visual detail where it is most needed. A very good example of effective use of attention, budget, and effort. Most of the action set pieces throughout the show are quite spectacular to behold, especially when Trevor Belmont, a character whom I will discuss a little bit later on, gets his awesome metal explodey whip thing. As far as sound is concerned, Castlevania also manages to perform admirably. Music is nothing special, but it's fine, does what it needs to. The sound design, as far as effects are concerned, is competent and the voice acting is good.
Would you please leave my testicles alone?
However, it would be dishonest if I didn't mention now that while the voice work is good, it was implemented in a rather off-putting manner. I don't know what it is, sometimes the voices sound fine and the problem you sort of get used to, but it feels like it's dubbed or something.
Speakers leave anywhere they deem right.
Like it's hovering above the visuals or something, overlaid on top of them instead of mixed in. All in all though, on a technical level, Castlevania is competently put together. This brings me to Castlevania's true strength. The thing that made me want to talk about it in the first place. Its characters and its narrative. It's a strange thing, its narrative is not what I would call original or unpredictable, all things considered. Once the initial premises of the story are set up, it unfolds more or less exactly how you might expect it to, or expect it should, at least on a grand narrative level. At this point in history, we are all familiar with vampires, their conventional behaviours, and more specifically Dracula as a character. The interesting part is, however, that on a micro level, on the level of individual plot points, the narrative plays some interesting games, tricks almost. This is all enhanced by its cast, a rather vast collection of very engaging characters, which are the primary driving force of the narrative. The interplay between these characters and the narrative is the true strength of Castlevania, and the reason why I found it so enjoyable. My intention is to delve into these characters a little bit, and walk through what makes them and their stories so entertaining, at least to me. But before I do that, I'm going to explore a little bit of the theory around what makes a character a good character. The question of what makes a character a good character has always caused me some degree of discomfort. It is, after all, a very difficult question to answer. I can never really put my finger on it. While bad characters can exist in well-crafted narratives, good characters rarely thrive in poorly conceived ones. The quality of a character, then, often depends on the quality of the narrative within which it lives, which itself depends on a massive array of other factors like the quality of the writing, the quality of the author, so on and so forth. Having said all of that, I do not believe that it is impossible to describe or at least narrow down what it means for a character to be a good character. And so, that is what I will attempt to do. I often separate them into three broad categories. These categories are bad characters, cool characters, and good characters. Bad characters. Bad characters are quite easy to identify. They're the kinds of characters that you wouldn't want to engage with in any situation, whether it's a conversation, a group project, or even a casual meetup. Not because they're villainous or unlikable, that's fine, but because they're insufferably bland. they're uninteresting, one-dimensional, and painfully flat. Think of the NPCs in video games, you know the ones.
Farewell.
The countless shopkeepers, random passerbys, and that one annoying exposition guy who spouts the same goddamn line of dialogue over and over again, incessantly, without rest.
Walk on. Bye.
Or the cliche freak of the week villains who only exist in a plot to fill the requirement of a villain. These are bad characters, and because of that, they are forgettable. I think then that it is fair to say that bad characters are easily segregated, boxed up, and pushed off to one side. Cool characters. Unfortunately, this is a slightly more difficult set of characters to parse out from the remaining pool, mostly because they are often entangled with good characters, as often good characters are also cool. Cool characters, put simply, are those flashy, stylish, and powerful characters who are just plain fun to watch. Having said that, they often lack depth. They are normally quite unsophisticated, and their motivations are often as simple as, I want to be the best, or I need to save the day, which, while entertaining, is not exactly what I would call compelling. If you ask yourself the question, what do I like about such and such a character? And the answer is something like, he has a really badass power, or that fight with such and such was really awesome, then the odds are the character you're thinking of is a cool one and not a good one. The final thing that I'd like to say about cool characters is that often, all that separates a cool character from a good one is the narrative they're a part of. Cool characters are often trapped in mediocre stories, ones communicated in a mundane way. Unfortunately, many of these cool characters are stuck in average stories that fail to explore their full potential, leaving them as memorable characters perhaps, but ultimately shallow ones. Good characters. Now, we've come to good characters, and this is where it gets a little bit complicated. Often, people say that a good character is relatable, flawed, and undergoes significant growth of some sort, almost always requiring the articulation and completion of a narrative arc. While I agree with these points, I think there's something more profound at play, something that invokes in us that primordial response that good characters invoke in us. This is where the brilliant psychotherapist Carl Jung's concept of archetypes comes in, and, if you're a philosopher, the genius that is Plato and his forms. Jungian archetypes, or Plato and his forms, are universal symbols or patterns that resonate with us on a deep, almost instinctual level. Ones common to all people simply because we're people. When a character embodies these archetypes, they become more than just figures in a story. They become representations of something fundamental to the human experience. That is what makes good characters good. For instance, imagine for a moment your 3 favorite characters who you yourself would describe as heroes. I am going to choose, say, King Arthur from Arthurian legend, Goku from Dragon Ball, and Lelouch from Code Geass. All of these characters are different, as are the ones I would imagine you have thought of. King Arthur is a brave knight sworn to the tenets of chivalry. Goku is a powerful Super Saiyan warrior with a simplistic and honest mode of being. And finally, Lelouch is this intelligent Machiavellian manipulator. However, despite their differences, they all share certain traits. Traits like courage, self-sacrifice, and commitment to a higher ideal. These traits aren't arbitrary. They're not just personal attributes. They're part of the archetypal hero pattern. That's what we recognize them as. That is why we recognize and respond to them, even if we can't articulate why. A good character, then, is one who embodies these archetypes, making them not just interesting, but deeply engaging and meaningful. Their character speaks to us across stories, and not just in the story we see them. That is what makes them good. This all brings me to Castlevania. I think that one of the things that Castlevania manages to get right, more often than not, is the art of weaving these archetypes into their characters' backstories, personalities, and narrative developments. I think this is what made Castlevania so interesting to watch, at least once again for me. With the idea of character quality explored to some degree, I want to take a closer look at Castlevania and note some of the things I think it gets right. I'm going to broadly break it down into the Dracula Arc and the Carmilla Arc. The narrative of the Dracula Arc is really quite simple, generic almost. If I describe to you the premise of the story, you could probably tell me how it would develop and conclude. To put it simply, Vlad Dracula Tsepesh meets a human woman, Lisa, who wishes to become a doctor. They fall in love, marry, and have a child whom they call Alucard. Dracula spelt backwards for those of you who are observant, because he is something of the antithesis of Dracula. In any case, Lisa wants Dracula to become more human, so she has him travel the world as a wanderer while she seeks to treat sick people as a doctor. Unfortunately, in an incredibly predictable way, the church decides that Lisa must be practicing witchcraft and therefore must be a witch. And of course, the natural solution is to burn her at the stake. Dracula, as you might imagine, gets rather upset and basically declares war on all of Wallachia, swearing that he and his dark armies will purge all traces of humanity from the land. Alucard, him being the opposite of Dracula, does not want this to happen, and so swears to stop his father. Eventually, he teams up with Trevor Belmont, the last living member of House Belmont, a famous family of monster hunters, and Saifa Belnades, a rather charismatic and powerful speaker magician. By the end of the arc, our intrepid heroes successfully find Dracula and kill him, resolving the whole impending apocalypse problem. The characters that appear in this arc are really likable, and I think their underlying motifs are very engaging. The villains of Castlevania are vampires with Dracula at their head. He is, however, different from how he is typically conveyed. Often when we think vampire, we immediately think Dracula. He's become synonymous with the term. And when we think Dracula, we think cruel, Machiavellian, ambitious, and all the other things that make vampires vampires, that make vampires that archetypal villain. Here, however, Dracula was all of those things, but not just those things. He is here broken, a shell of his former self, destroyed by the loss of his beloved wife, doomed to an eternity of loneliness. As far as archetypal villains are concerned, as I said, you cannot really do any better than Dracula. He is, after all, basically just Satan. He has everything a cool villain needs to be a cool villain, but he also has a sympathetic motivation and one that we can all understand, one that is truly archetypal. The idea of anybody spending all of eternity alone in that grief-stricken state is a truly sad one, and it motivates us on a deep level, as I said. This is what makes him not just a cool character, but a good character. The juxtaposition between the Satan-like Dracula and the broken Vlad Tepes is brilliant. It elevates him from the usual big bad into a figure of mythic proportions. Alucard's character is defined by the classic motif of the son destined to confront the father. From Zeus overthrowing Kronos in ancient Greek mythology to Luke Skywalker's confrontation with the evil Darth Vader. Alucard's internal conflict, torn between his love from his father and his duty to stop him, adds a profound emotional layer to his character. He may be the least personable of the trio, but his tragic destiny and moments of vulnerability make him deeply compelling. Saifa Belnades has probably got the weakest character narrative of the three hero characters, but she is wonderfully endearing. She fulfills the role of the arcane expert in the group, a bit like Yennefer in The Witcher. She is this cheerful, bright speaker magician with a very good sense of humour, a sense of humour that often acts as a counterbalance for the darker, more brooding elements of the story and her companion heroes. And she often acts as sort of the motivational spirit of the group, which is again quite important. Trevor Belmont, the last of the hero characters, embodies the classic hero archetype brilliantly, with the welcome added ornament of that last of a noble line motif, as he is burdened with the legacy and the uncertain future of the Belmont line. Disheveled and sarcastic, Trevor is a reluctant hero in a sorry state, but the question of whether he will rise to restore the Belmont name adds a welcome tension to his journey. This motif of the last of a family line is a personal favourite of mine. Watching Trevor grapple with his destiny, whether to let the Belmont legacy crumble and fade away, or to reignite it in a brilliant blaze of glory and remind the world what it means to fear the Belmonts, is one of the most compelling aspects of his character arc by far. There are several more characters that appear in the Dracula arc, many of whom go on to play more significant roles later on. There is Carmilla, the literal embodiment of that vampiric desire for ambition. Then there's the Forge Master's Hector, who is this naive and childish man manipulated by basically everyone around him, and Isaac, completely loyal and devoted to Dracula, who is almost treated like a son by Dracula. The Dracula arc's strengths lie, I think, in its archetypal characters. The narrative, broadly speaking, is quite predictable. However, the rich array of endearing characters and their compelling motivations make it a gripping and memorable experience. Each character, whether hero or villain, plays into their narrative archetype brilliantly, making the Dracula arc not just entertaining, but also deeply resonating. Before I move on to the Carmilla arc, let me pause for a moment and offer a few thoughts on the world of Castlevania. One aspect of storytelling that is infamously criticized is that presence of plot armor that everybody hates. That feeling of weightlessness, like nothing matters and there are no consequences, because after all, it's not like your favorite character is going to die. This problem is very difficult for storytellers to solve. If I tell you a story about a hero who rises up to save the princess from a villain, it's rather difficult for me to make the danger of the story feel real because I can't kill the main character. The reason for this, of course, is because the narrative's conclusion, the confrontation with the villain, depends on the hero confronting the villain, and the hero needs to be alive to do that. Maybe the hero can be injured or die during the final confrontation, but not really before then. If I'm very brave, I might be willing to tell you a story where I kill the hero before then, but most writers are simply unwilling to tell that story. And if we're totally honest, it wouldn't be a very compelling one if they did. At least if they did it unskillfully. Imagine if in Star Wars, after Luke learning that Darth Vader is his father, after he is trained to become a Jedi Master, George Lucas turned around and decided to have him die in the pit fighting the Rancor. It wouldn't be very satisfying because there'd be no narrative payoff for the conflict with Darth Vader. So, as I've said, this is a difficult problem to solve. However, it does have solutions. One way to combat this problem is to implement the stratagem that George Martin implemented in Game of Thrones. Martin figured out, correctly, that if he simply created a massive number of characters and then ensured that they die off regularly, while also introducing more characters into the pool, he could create the sense that death was a genuine risk, because it actually was. If at the start of Season 1 there are 10 characters and by the end there are only 4, then in Season 2, assuming it follows the same path as Season 1, when you begin to fall in love with your favorite character, you know there's a pretty good chance they're going to die, and therefore, you're afraid of that. It adds vitally needed tension to the story. Another way to solve this problem is to subvert narrative motifs with well-implemented twists. This is more difficult and requires more sophistication. In Castlevania, the writers tackle plot armor in 2 clever ways. First, they establish a world that is dark, cruel, and full of peril. Not by killing off main characters like George or Martin, but by showing the ruthless slaughter of countless innocents, just NPC characters. This creates an immediate sense of danger, even if it's short-lived, unlike J.R.R.'s strategy. To sustain this tension, Castlevania then subverts, however, traditional narrative expectations. While the hero's confrontation with Dracula is inevitable, the timing of their confrontation is completely unknown. Castlevania carefully sets up the narrative so that you expect the final confrontation with Dracula to happen way down the road, whilst also introducing the idea that Carmilla might steal the chance to kill Dracula out from under the heroes and claim his throne for herself. They then decide that instead of dragging out the confrontation, they force the final showdown much earlier than you might have expected, at the end of Season 2, cutting off side plots like Carmilla's and cementing the illusion of risk. The unexpected twist helps maintain that tension, making the world of Castlevania feel genuinely dangerous. The fact that they're willing to kill off a character as significant as Dracula earlier than you thought helps build that illusion. Having said all of that, the trick that Castlevania would pull off in the Carmilla Arc to sustain this tension, I think at least, blows this one out of the water. But I'll get to that one in a minute. In the Carmilla Arc, the tension in the world that Dracula creates dies down with his death. However, a degree of chaos begins to settle into the lands of Wallachia. Carmilla decides to take the now enslaved Hector, who she tricked into betraying Dracula, back to her castle. There, she and her sister vampires Eleonora, Morana, and Striga set about planning to conquer a vast swath of land so that they can live in it eternally in comfort and safety. Isaac, who was tossed through a teleportation mirror thing by Dracula so that he would survive his death, decides that he will get revenge on Hector for betraying Dracula. The heroes, for their part, decide to separate. Alucard decides to remain in Dracula's castle so that neither it nor the Belmont family house will fall into the hands of evildoers, whilst Trevor and Sypha simply go off gallivanting into a dangerous and uncertain world. By the end of the arc, Carmilla and her gang are defeated by Isaac, who becomes oddly philosophical over the season, even going so far as to forgive Hector in a rather altruistic way. Alucard, Trevor, and Sypha eventually meet up after farting around for a while and confront a being who is not literally death, but may as well be. They save the day. There's a little bait and switch, bittersweet ending, but I'll talk about that in a second. And then the show ends. The character of Carmilla and her sisters are an interesting change from the broken and grief-stricken Dracula. We never really saw Dracula in his prime, we only ever saw this sort of broken version. But the Carmilla sisters sort of represent Dracula before he was broken. It's as if you took Dracula's character from before he was broken and divided them into his 4 primary elements. The Carmilla sisters each exemplify some aspect of this vampiric archetype, and by extension, Dracula himself. Carmilla is a vampire's unquenchable ambition, Eleonora that Machiavellian disposition, Striga represents their raw combat ability, and Marana their brilliant ability to pull the strings of the world from the shadows. They all provide an interesting look into what it means for a character to be a vampire. What does it mean to be blinded by an insatiable desire? What does a Machiavellian manipulator do when all that's left is human cattle in the world? Would a vampire really want to spend all of eternity maintaining and defending their feeding grounds, consumed by that endless labor? Puts forward some interesting questions, and the characters themselves are quite charismatic, so I think they succeed in this way. Hector and Isaac are developed quite a bit more in Carmilla's arc as well. I'm not much of a fan of Hector, but he does develop a bit throughout the arc. He goes from being this easily manipulated man-child to someone capable of manipulating others, which is nice to see, though I am not condoning manipulation. Isaac, on the other hand, has this strange arc. He sort of goes from this avenging angel to this oddly philosophical, almost prophet-like character. Very odd, but it's entertaining, and that's what matters. The arc for Trevor, Sypha, and Alucard is also very strange. At this point in the show, after the death of Dracula, these 3 were easily my favourite characters, Trevor and Sypha in particular. However, they don't really do much in Carmilla's arc, at least not up until the very end. Alucard does virtually nothing, and Trevor and Sypha literally spend 2 seasons farting around killing night creatures. But this directionlessness is actually a strength in the Carmilla arc. Because these characters have no direction, they have no narrative purpose, and so can be killed off with virtually no narrative repercussions. And if you are observant, you notice this, as they were my favourite characters, and because of the illusion of danger that was set up in the Dracula arc, I was genuinely worried about their safety. The world seemed just cruel enough to kill them just because I liked them. There is this one part of the narrative where several of the different conflicts are reaching their climax, and I was honestly worried that they were going to kill Trevor, Sypha, Alucard, or even Hector. Fortunately, they didn't, but it certainly felt like they could have. And that is an accomplishment worth noting. All in all, I really enjoyed Castlevania. The Dracula arc was really good, the world felt dangerous, and the characters were compelling. The Carmilla arc was also very good. The first half was better than the second, and the final ending was a little cheap. Basically, it looked like Trevor was going to die to this death being thing, and he sort of nobly sacrificed himself, but then they like bait and switched you and he actually came back to life, and well, it felt kind of cheap. I'd rather the bittersweet ending, but that's just me. In any case, the arc in its totality was still very compelling. I think Castlevania is a really great example of how to implement narrative archetypes to make a story compelling, even whilst also remaining relatively traditional, predictable, and safe in your overarching narrative. After finishing Castlevania, I had planned to watch Castlevania Nocturnal. I've not had much of a chance to watch it fully yet. I have watched a couple episodes, however. It does seem worse than Castlevania, just the generic normal one, but I'll have to keep watching and see what happens. I might make a video about it when I'm finished, assuming you all want to see that. Let me know if you do. With that said, I hope you enjoyed the video. Please consider leaving a like and maybe even a comment. I would really appreciate it, and I'd also appreciate if you subscribe to the channel. It would mean a lot to me. If you have any recommendations for anime that you'd like me to talk about, let me know, and I'll give it a think. I have a list as long as my arm, but it's always nice to get more. In any case, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I really do wish you a pleasant day. See you next time. Goodbye.